Hello, I'm Morgan Jorgensen, the Donor Relations and Events Manager for the Truman Library Institute. Welcome to Grand Improvisation with Derek Leibarth, the 2020 Harry S. Truman Book Award winner. Established in 1967, the Harry S. Truman Book Award recognizes the best book published within a 2-year period that focuses on Truman's life, career, and/or aspects of his administration. Special thanks to Mary and John Hunkler, who endowed the Book Award program with a generous gift to our Stay True Capital campaign, and are watching the program tonight. Mary and John, thank you for your long-standing support of the Institute. The spectacular new Truman Library is now open, and fundraising for the Capital campaign is still ongoing. To book your tickets to the museum or support the campaign, visit our website at trumanlibraryinstitute.org. Thank you to our supporters near and far who have already joined the campaign and made possible this new chapter of Truman's legacy. For this evening's program, Derek will be joined in conversation by Jason Parker, Truman Library Institute board member and chair of the Harry S. Truman Book Award Committee. Jason is a professor of history and the Cornerstone Faculty Fellow at Texas A&M University. At the conclusion of the 45-minute presentation, there will be a 10 to 15-minute Q&A session. Questions can be submitted during and immediately following the remarks via the Q&A feature at the bottom of your screen. Now, it is my pleasure to turn the microphone over to Jason Parker.
Thank you, Morgan, and thanks to everyone for joining us this evening. I regret we can't all be together in person at the Truman Library tonight, but I suppose the silver lining is that this is a larger audience than we could have fit into the auditorium there, even I gather in the new and improved version that's just opened up. It's not every day that one finds oneself in the presence of a real-life Renaissance man, but it is our collective privilege to do so tonight. It is my honor and pleasure to introduce Derek Leibarth. I knew of Derek's highly acclaimed scholarly works before this one, but it wasn't until I chaired this committee that I learned of his many other accomplishments. Derek got his undergraduate degree at Vanderbilt University, went on to earn a master's at Columbia and a doctorate in economics at Oxford. He's kept a foot in the academic world more or less since then, holding fellowships at Harvard, the Smithsonian, teaching foreign affairs at Georgetown, and founding 3 enduring periodicals, including the prestigious academic journal International Security. In his day job, so to speak, he is a technology executive and a co-founding partner of the consulting firm MAP AG, Management Alignment Partners. In his free time, it's hard to imagine there's any left, he served in the U.S. Marine Corps, was a founder of the National Museum of the U.S. Army, and is a trustee at the U.S. Army Historical Foundation and at Providence Hospital in Washington, D.C. He's the author of a half dozen other excellent books besides this one, including a trilogy with MIT Press on the IT Revolution, 2002's The 50-Year Wound, How America's Cold War Victory Shapes Our World, required reading in many graduate seminars, 2006's To Dare and to Conquer, Special Operations and the Destiny of Nations from Achilles to Al-Qaeda, required reading at the U.S. Special Operations Command. Magic and Mayhem from 2010, subtitled The Delusions of American Foreign Policy from Korea to Afghanistan, should be required reading at the Pentagon, Foggy Bottom, and the White House. This last is true as well of the book we're here to honor tonight, Grand Improvisation, America Confronts the British Superpower, 1945 to 1957. Our 2020 Truman Book Award Committee consisted of 5 historians from across the country, myself, the late Kurt Cardwell, Amy Sayward, Tom Zeiler, and Nicole Sackley, who had the privilege of reading all the many books submitted for the prize. We judge based on the quality of the archival research, the originality and depth of the historical analysis, and on the caliber of the prose. As I wrote in my announcement on behalf of the committee at the time, in an especially competitive field of contenders, Derek Leibarth's Grand Improvisation rose to the top as an excellent examination of the relationship between the United States and the United Kingdom in the post-World War II era. Leibarth offers a nuanced and sophisticated reading of the Anglo-American special relationship from VE Day to Suez, showing that the post-war transition from British to American world primacy was slower, rockier, and more improvised than is commonly thought. Deeply researched and engagingly written, Grand Improvisation is a most worthy recipient of our prize. As committee chair, it is my privilege to present, virtually, yes, but wholeheartedly, the Truman Book Award to Derek Leibarth for Grand Improvisation. Congratulations, Derek. I hereby pass the mic over to you.
Thank you, Jason. And here indeed is the award that I'm indeed honored to have. What I would propose to do is to speak for 15 minutes, laying out the theme of my argument. And then we can get into the details of the vast subject of Truman administration foreign policy and what came after in a Q&A. And we can drill down into fascinating questions, say, such as the origin of the Truman Doctrine itself, or NATO, or the Korean War. But let me first emphasize the timeliness of our conversation tonight, because again, America confronts questions of its altered place in the world. There is talk, certainly here in Washington, about new Cold Wars and the rise of another competitive superpower in China. The same decision-making conclaves at the Defense Department, at state, now in the think tanks, are all spending time on issues that are not too different from what were debated after World War II. But there is a myth, and what I tried to do in Grand Improvisation is to go beyond that myth. It's assumed that World War II ended, that the British Empire, the largest, grandest in history, covering a quarter of the world's land surface, was too weak and dispirited to carry on with its longtime imperial role, and that a newly confident, prosperous, well-armed America then came forth and, as so many historians have romanticized it, carried the baton of world leadership as the previous hegemonic power, as academics called it, retreated. And therefore, America very quickly created the world order and the structures and the alliances that we know today. But I would argue that that is not at all what happened. And there is new material that goes far in explaining why. The term superpower itself was coined by a professor in 1944, and it has a specific definition. It means a great power that also has the ability to project its power anywhere on the planet, and that has an ultra-modern arsenal, that has fully established intelligence apparatuses, and that also has a network of global relationships to leverage such power. By that definition, very quickly after World War II, there was only one true superpower on the planet, in contrast to America, still with its insular tradition, being perhaps a global super island state. The Soviet Union, which had been designated as one of the three superpowers in 1944, wasn't quite that. Beyond espionage and sabotage, it couldn't project its power beyond the Eurasian landmass. And the United States very quickly demobilized, and the military budgets of the late 40s stand witness to our traditional insularity. The British, however, demobilized far slower and less than did the United States and the Soviet Union. America is also an immigrant nation, and so many of us have really come here to get away from the sordid politics of the old world, and that too emphasizes the insularity in the United States that is much deeper than even today is understood. So America in 1946, by 46, Churchill had left as prime minister. We faced a very shrewd, very adept, very determined British suzerainty in London. It was now a Labour government, But there's a big difference in understanding the labor government that has often been overlooked. And that is that these were tough, bare-knuckled hombres who knew Stalinism, who did not have many of the illusions about Soviet Russia that indeed FDR and arguably Churchill held right up until the end. These were tough labor union leaders who had literally fought Soviet influence in the street in creating their labor organizations, and who used the word Nazis in describing Stalinism, and indeed did it to their faces of the Soviet diplomats. And these were men who had no intention at all of retreating from Britain's global role. And they would continue to assert their power for the next dozen years, or the Labour government until 1951, when Churchill returned to power, which itself is a whole extraordinary story because Churchill's peacetime premiership has been looked at in only the most cursory fashion by all of his biographers. And at the time, many of his contemporaries believed that he was the most articulate and indeed perhaps equally forceful as he had been during the war years in confronting the United States from 1951 until he left office in 1955. It was not until the Eisenhower administration and not until 1956 that America explicitly avowed a declaration of independence from the British Empire. And Vice President Nixon said that henceforth, America would assume the foreign policy leadership of the free world. That had decidedly not been the case before. And only then, in 1956, at the time of Suez, of course, did The Economist, a magazine reflecting British establishment opinion, admit that Britain is no longer a superpower. And during those dozen years, there was ongoing contention between London and Washington in the role that the United States would assume in the world and what significance the British Empire held for the United States. It was not until the mid-50s, when Britain still had the strongest military force in Western Europe, when it was just about still leading in jet aviation technology and in other industries of the future, that Americans started to get the bit in their teeth, and after the Korean War, and to acknowledge that a larger, more assertive US role had to be conducted. And there is another key part about the American post-war global presence that is always overlooked. Everyone, with nary an exception in the United States, in the Washington of 1945, expected the return of the Depression. And fear of the Depression would overshadow nearly all US decisions for a decade after World War II. The demobilization of 10 or 11 million men was expected to send unemployment rates sky high. There was still no understanding of Keynesian dynamic economics. So all of this factored into the decision of why America was very slow out of the gate in assuming the global role that is always presumed to have happened. And we see this time and again, the US reticence to lead, the insularity of the American public, the slashed military budgets of the late 1940s. And we can drill down into issue after issue, which didn't quite occur the way we commonly believe, whether it's the Truman Doctrine, the founding of Israel, the origins of NATO, or indeed the beginning of the Korean War itself. all of these issues were framed by a greater complexity. Ultimately, and let me conclude these opening remarks, ultimately in 1950 emerged a singular document that is one of the most important as well as relatively unknown documents of the later 20th century. And it is NSC 75, of which the far better known NSC 69 is merely a spinoff. A national security document, then as today, is ideally a high-level, agency-wide, department-wide US government consensus on a particular issue. And NSC 75, which emerged in June 1950 on the cusp of the Korean War, had a handful of conclusions. One, the British Empire and its Commonwealth had not remotely retreated since 1945. It had merely adjusted, as in the subcontinent and in its relations with its dominion. Nor would the British Empire retreat in the foreseeable future. The conclusion also stated that the empire was impossible to replace because of the deployments, the skill, and the technology it possessed, and that the value of the British Empire, as long as anyone could see, would be as a valuable outer fortress for the United States. But as far as replacing the empire, that was a bridge too far, too expensive, unlikely, and unnecessary. And we would be living with the British Empire and Commonwealth for a long, long time to come, in the conclusion of NSC 75, which is titled America and the Future of the British Empire. So let me close on those provocative notes. And then in our discussion, perhaps we can get into the specific policy issues, how they were arrived at, perhaps the people that were making these decisions. And ideally, we can cover new ground. So Jason, thanks for giving me this opportunity to speak.
Thanks, Derek. That's was a wonderful summation of an insightful and provocative addition to the scholarly literature, which does the valuable service of rethinking some of these things we think we know. It's very healthy to go back and revisit. NSC 68, which you mentioned, is, of course, catechism in all of our classes.
Sure.
NSC 75 belongs in those conversations too, and you rarely see it. Your book was one of the few I can think of in recent history to really highlight it, and I praise you for that because it deserves center stage. I also wanted to praise your prose, just writer to writer. It's beautifully written. That means a lot. So everyone listening, this is not just a book by an acclaimed historian for other historians. It is extremely accessible to the lay reader as well as to the specialist. It also, as Derek just laid out, lays out some challenges for the conventional wisdom, I think very much successfully for the most part. I identify a couple of sort of bigger historical literature contributions, and then we can drill down to the specific things a little bit later on. I guess what I wanted to highlight, I enjoyed the way, and I found myself persuaded, that the 1945 passing of the baton myth really can't stand up to scrutiny by the time you take all the contingencies as well as the paper trails and put them on set. Indeed, it's tough to argue at the end of this book that there's really much to the special relationship besides the sort of retroactive, shall we say, utilitarian deployment of the trope by those who needed it for various reasons. I enjoyed the way the book helps to reframe the post-war away from the Cold War. As you know, it's a long-running parlor game for historians to argue about when exactly the Cold War begins. This is actually one of the things I find useful for hooking students. It's almost like a gateway drug. If I can say, all right, so everybody knows when World War II begins, right? You've got invasion of Poland, you've got Pearl Harbor. So when did the Cold War begin? And everyone scratches their heads. And so you're scratching your head for a good reason, because there's a half dozen good candidates, and you have to sort of prioritize what you think are the Cold War's qualities that help to make it finally take its definition. But that itself can become a kind of an intellectual trap. It becomes almost a self-fulfilling prophecy, which your book, I think, pulls us away from. I think that's very, very good. I like as well, the final large contribution I identified was the way that you deflated the notion of grand strategy. I mean, it's right there in the title. But grand strategy, like the special relationship, is something that gets sort of written up after the fact, often by actors like Kennan, who himself wanted to take some sort of authorship of something quite so grandiose. Maybe that's what we should call it, as grandiose strategy instead of grand strategy. But substituting improvisation for strategy is a useful, I find persuasive corrective. Now, it might be because I read this right in the thick of the pandemic and other lockdown madness, in a year, 2020, that was so chock full of events itself that it seemed fitting, I guess, to read a narrative that covers only 12 years, but it is so packed, and you really are excellent at highlighting the fluidity and the connectedness and the speed with which all of these events are unfolding, in the interest of pushing back against the idea of the passing of the baton 1945 in the name of a sort of transatlantic partnership. I guess I wanted to ask Derek, just by way of sort of getting our broader conversation going. So your 50-Year Wound book of about 20 years ago, I think splits the Cold War into three sections, three parts. And this book matches more or less with the first section of that book. So I guess I have to ask, and hopefulness, is this the first of a trilogy? You're going to do further books on the next couple of phases, because this is a valuable contribution. And if you took that original 50-Year Wound structure and sort of spun it out into this, and I don't know what the exact connection you found between writing that one and writing this one. I'd be interested in your process. But you know, you've got two more phases of the Cold War that you could sort of give this treatment to, even as you were pulling us away from that framing. Maybe this is the further work of that, is to sort of get us outside of that mental prison.
Well, thanks for the encouragement. But the 50-Year Wound, which came out nearly exactly 2 decades ago, is what got me interested in the larger questions of how Americans make decisions about foreign policy, how we see the world, how deep our insularity might be. And not least of all, here is the largest empire in history, with the British Empire and Commonwealth. And it seemed highly unlikely that, kabang, all of a sudden it turned out the lights and retreated to being a small island in the North Atlantic. So there was an inherent mystery there I wanted to understand, and that was the motivation for getting into grand improvisation.
I see. Well, I think that makes excellent sense, and it does point me to another question, which made me wonder if you continued the story into the 60s for Britain. By the time you get to the end of your book, you're only 10 years away from the withdrawal, the announcement of the withdrawal east of Suez, right? Which ends up in your last pages, I think. So if we're talking about a 12-year period after 1945 that is so jam-packed with various kinds of events, many of which we've missed and we need to rediscover, you're not even 10 years past that, and you're already seeing, I guess, the ebb of British superpowerdom. I mean, when can we say that the superpower of the 40s?
The British acknowledged it not only after the debacle at Suez,
right,
but with Sputnik in October 1957. By then it was clear there is no competing with the grand superpowers, certainly with the Soviet Union and also with the United States. But where America truly got the bit in its teeth to, in my opinion, start spreading itself too thin and trying to fine-tune the planet was with the Kennedy administration and the rousing rhetoric of no price too great, and that America's frontiers now were not only on the Rhine, but on the Mekong. And this expansive militaristic interpretation of America's interest. That had not occurred in the Truman era, nor during the Eisenhower administration. It was a new approach to the world, and one that opened up perhaps lots of difficulties that we still live with today.
It is true that the distance traveled, not to get us away from Truman and from your book, but the distance traveled between Kennedy's inaugural address and the Nixon doctrine some 8 years later, from pay any price, bear any burden, to essentially we're going to help people help themselves and peel back out these frontline this way of frontline thinking. It's quite astonishing. And so there too, to loop back to the question about the next phase of this into Britain in the 60s and its sort of full ebb. William Roger Lewis says that the Suez Crisis is what really did it. It's what brought the scramble out of Africa. It's when you sort of bookend from the Congress of Berlin to Suez, and you have the era of high colonialism and then decolonization in fairly rapid succession. I guess I'm curious to know, because not many authors can include anecdotes in their footnotes about a conversation they had with Lord Mountbatten, but you have that in this book. How do you pull together the kind of research when it involves such an extensive personal and rich personal history in your life?
What historians enjoy, as you know so well, is primarily getting into the archives. That's wherein everything rests. To have the thrill of seeing documents that perhaps have not been held, let alone read, since Harry Truman might have last looked at it with Dean Acheson. And there's the prospect that you or I could be the first to discover those documents, as indeed one comes close with NSC 75, given that it was so tightly held and that I had to get it declassified. And we see, however, exaggerations and myths being formed, such as the significance of NSC 68 in contrast. And another joy is being able to puncture those myths and to lay out other stories that might be more credible with the documentation.
Yeah, it is also, I find always humbling to try and see the event through the document and through the eyes of the people who wrote it and read it at the time. I found myself in writing my books to become more sympathetic to people who I didn't expect to become more sympathetic to. I know in your book, you come in quite harshly on George Kennan, which, you're not the first, but it's true that he has almost exalted status in many circles, and I think it was a well done puncturing. Were there any figures besides perhaps Ernest Bevin who you came away from this process with a greater admiration for than you had?
To be sure, yes, probably the greatest Secretary of the Treasury in U.S. history, certainly since Gallatin in the post-revolutionary days. And that was John Snyder, who was Harry Truman's closest friend. And they worked hand in glove. They'd worked hand in glove during the Truman Committee years of World War II. And Snyder did what America is very good at, mobilizing our resources, financial, and focusing them on specific objectives. And he had superb relations with Dean Acheson and George Marshall, as of course he did with Truman. So I came away with a new understanding of the clout, when done correctly, of the US Treasury and of a great Treasury Secretary.
And Snyder is, you're right, a lesser known and underappreciated actor. He's one of a couple of folks who popped out of your pages. James Webb would be another one, who tends to get in the shadows of people like Acheson.
Well, the reason for that is because Kennan and Acheson were such dazzling writers. They wrote the story. And in the case of Kennan, intellectuals see someone such as themselves, and they are inclined to heroize Kennan. Whereas if one looks deeply, and no one has previously, I would argue, looked deeply enough, one finds a lot that is simply untrue in the Kennan memoir that just don't stand up to scrutiny.
Right.
Those assertions get repeated too often, year in and year out. What I would like to put on the table, just for 1 second, to perhaps provoke some of the rest of us tonight, are key misunderstandings about those Harry Truman years. That in the Truman Doctrine, for example, March 1947, the administration, Dean Acheson especially, was utterly bluffed into those commitments in Greece by the British. The documents from Ernest Bevin make that very clear. He was casting a net and pulling in the US, and he could use British resources much better elsewhere. Another provocative finding on the Berlin blockade, the United States was fully ready to retreat from Berlin in June 1948 when the Soviets blockaded. And that was a pivot point of history, arguably. A retreat from Berlin could have undermined everything, with much of Western Europe to follow. But it was the British determination to send in reinforcements and to demand that the United States step up to the plate that only with a long, long delay did Washington say, well, okay, we'll stay too. Mm-hmm. So there, time and again, we see these provocative pivot points.
Mm-hmm. And I think that that's a valuable addition, because it's true that both of those stories are told in a kind of an America-centric way in most cases, that the Truman team especially, but more broadly, that this is Washington slowly waking up to the responsibilities that it now finds on its shoulders. I disagree, I guess, a little bit on the Truman Doctrine, just because I think that it does mark an important break in the intellectual history of this team. This is where they began to sort of get it, and importantly, connected it backwards to the Nazis, as the British labor folks had already done. But to see the text of the Truman Doctrine and not hardly find the word communist in it, it says totalitarian, and it makes very.
And it's a terrorist. It's an anti-terrorist measure, because we were fighting terrorism in Greece. Oh, and you're entirely correct. The Truman Doctrine itself is a seminal event. It's just that the assumptions behind it were misguided, because we were certain the British were going to leave Greece in essentially the middle of a civil war and open it up to perhaps Soviet expansion. Mm-hmm. And my point was, according to British documentation, no, they had no intention of leaving.
Excellent. Well, I don't want to pull us away from those things and out of the Truman years, but I guess I wanted to ask, just as a matter of not so much structure, but coverage. I found you did a great job on the waterfront. There are only a few things that popped up into my head that I would have liked to see more on. But let me ask you, as the writer, are there things you wish you could have covered? I mean, you had 500 pages, and you covered pretty much everything one could ask for. But are there things you had to leave on the cutting room floor that you would have loved to spend more time with?
Well, one could go on endlessly about the downsides of American foreign policy making. Now, to be sure, Truman, Acheson, and Marshall were cautious men, as was much of the American public at that time, about our role in the world. And that caution, step by step, got lost. Eisenhower, Dulles, these were cautious men. And you can see their reticence even to get involved in Southeast Asia, Vietnam. But then very quickly, that caution was abandoned in the early 60s. And one could write tomes about American foreign policy making. For example, our appointee system that doesn't rely perhaps on a grand, powerful foreign service, as it did at the time, certainly in Britain, but on political appointees. What are the consequences of that? So these procedural issues one could go on and on about with great fascination, perhaps.
Indeed, and specific topics. The only one that really sort of jumped out the largest that I wish you'd been able to cover, but I'm glad to be able to ask you about now, is the Point 4 program, as a kind of an early version of soft power. I don't know if in your analysis of superpowers that hard power matters so much more that we can kind of ignore it. But this is, I mean, everyone knows the Marshall Plan. Much less well known is Point 4, which they went out of their way not to characterize as a Marshall Plan for the world, but which they did see as part and parcel of a broader sort of thinking about how to handle communism as a global force. And one of the ways Point 4 is supposed to do it, for those who don't know, it's essentially an aid and technical development program for countries that are on their way to developing, right? So it's helping to improve agriculture in Iran and things like this. It's an early version of USAID. It's called the Technical Cooperation Administration. It's an underappreciated part of the Truman portfolio, I think. And so I wondered if that was something that had crossed your radar as you were producing this, and decided consciously or not, perhaps, to skip over this particular topic.
You're entirely correct. It is a superb example of soft power, which I tried to address in general terms, such as locust eradication in the Middle East, which cost us nothing to do, yet paid enormous dividends. And perhaps I did slight the Point 4 program, but by that stage, one can also get lost in so many programs and names and policies and so on. So part of the challenge of being an historian, as you know so well, is what does one leave out? Because it's like sculpting. You have to know what to keep to be sure, but most important, what to leave out. And regrettably, one can't include everything in if one wants to have a literary narrative.
Of course. No, it's just sort of an axiom that any book could be twice as long, you know, if you just sort of went on and on about whatever it is. And you're right that the real art of it is to find that sweet spot. I don't want to monopolize any further. I see we have some questions piling up in the Q&A. I have some things we can maybe circle back to, but let me just hand it over to Morgan if she wants to play MC and work us through some of the questions.
Absolutely. Thank you, Jason. Okay, our first question this evening is from John Hunkler, who at the beginning of the program we recognized with his wife Mary for being the folks that endowed the Truman Book Award. So thank you again, John and Mary. And his question is, how does the Iron Curtain speech by Churchill play in this game?
Oh, that's a pivotal question. And Churchill gave his Iron Curtain speech in March 1946. And right from the beginning, it was extremely controversial because Churchill envisioned and asked for a global US-British Empire military alliance. And the Americans had no such enthusiasm for that. Indeed, what had not been known is that Churchill's son Randolph was also in the United States during that visit. Although he was not there with his father, he stayed in Washington. And he started telling highly influential journalists like the columnist Walter Lippmann that the British intention was very much to bring America into global conflicts. And he had said, Randolph did, we've done it before and we'll do it again. And they were searching for a backstop to the British Empire. And that speech in itself became extremely controversial and got lots of pushback at the time.
Excellent. Our next question is from Ryan, and Ryan asks, what do you make of the revisionist idea that Truman could have avoided conflict with Stalin and prevent the Cold War?
Well, that's an ongoing debate, but my study of Stalin and Stalinism would say there was very little possibility of that, of preventing a confrontation one way or another with Stalinist Russia. Even if FDR had survived, it has often been said, well, they would have reached some accommodation. No, this was one of the world's foremost massacre makers of history. Unlike Hitler, however, he wasn't a reckless gambler. He was far, far smarter. And it is improbable there would have been any Soviet invasion of Western Europe, but it would have been a push, push, push until a democratic France collapsed and much of Western Europe went with it. And it was expansionist in my judgment and utterly murder mongering as well.
I would add too that just by coincidence, within a few days of Roosevelt's death, so already in April 1945, right as Truman is about to ascend to the White House, we found this out at the end of the Cold War, and Soviet archives, Russian archives were briefly fully open, and they closed back up mostly. Stalin's team, not his pen directly, but the Politburo, was sending orders to Western European communist parties saying, okay, get yourselves ready, the war's going to be over soon, and we're going to get back to work. So the Cold War is always sort of going on in Stalin's mind. One of my favorite sort of factoids when I teach is, I say the Russians are past masters, Soviets are past masters at espionage. And during the war, about 3/4 of their espionage assets were deployed in the West, not against Hitler, with whom they're in a life and death struggle. That's a very telling statistic, I think.
All right, the next question is from Michael, and Michael asks, what was the attitude of US military leaders who had served in and worked with UK during the war?
Hello?
Yes.
Hi, we can still hear you, Derek.
Oh, sorry. The attitude of US military leaders to their British counterparts is mixed. The British chiefs of staff really harshly disdain so many of the Americans on very poor grounds. Field Marshal Alan Brooke, who was Churchill's primary military advisor, thought even George Marshall was amateurish. But here one sees a lot of bitterness surfacing. Though there were always abrasions, even on the military front, and that's why Eisenhower ultimately was so important, because Eisenhower was a superb manager and diplomat and conciliator, which is why FDR appointed him. And that testiness in the military relationship did carry on through the Truman era. And the Americans very consciously ended the combined chiefs of staff of the wartime years. And no matter how much the British importuned, we were not going to create it at the start of the Cold War.
Excellent. Our next question is from Ryan. And Ryan asks, when you are searching for new historical documents and materials, at what point do you begin looking for classified documents? How do you become aware that something you need is classified?
Well, let me here talk about my work at the superb, unsurpassed Truman Library. Yes, one can ask the marvelous archivists to bring out boxes and to guide a researcher through all the thousands and millions, indeed, of pages. But after a while, a researcher will start seeing gaps. For example, a document NSC 75 referred to by Dean Acheson and George Marshall as being pivotally important. And then you don't see an NSC 75 in the archives. You see NSC 68, which is an intriguing spin-off, and you see NSC 68 reflecting elements from a larger body of work. But where is that larger body of work? And that's where an historian, a researcher says, aha, I want to start a declassification process and see the original that is not yet being declassified.
Excellent.
That's right.
All right, our next question is from Stephen, and Stephen asks, if the British bluffed the US vis-a-vis Greece, was it done with the express purpose of bringing the US out of its insular tendencies as manifest before Pearl Harbor and make of the US a more robust world actor?
Yes, absolutely. The intent is clear. The fear of Foreign Secretary Ernest Bevin, a top labor organizer, was that it was all too likely patterns would repeat, and that the United States, as after World War I, would go back to its insular ways, and that the British Empire would be left to its own devices in a world utterly flat. France was a thin reed, as was Italy, and it faced predatory Stalinism. And this was a deliberate effort by Foreign Secretary Ernest Bevin to pull the United States into global, or not global, but into political military engagement against the Soviet Union, yes, and to backstop the British Empire. But remember, the empire itself was dominant in the Middle East, as it would be essentially until the time of Suez. What they couldn't control then was an ever larger US interest in the Middle East, exemplified at first by the oil companies, and then after Korea with a more political military twist.
And it predates your period a little bit, but people like Bevin in choosing to go this route could sort of point back to the four policemen of Roosevelt's vintage and say, all right, well, they're already on board in principle with the idea of sort of regional responsible actors. We just have to get them further in and backstop our own power while we're at it.
But this is why the entire topic that we're addressing, and indeed the work of the Truman Library and the Truman Institute itself, is so vitally relevant to what's happening now. How many times are we seeing headlines and reading articles about a new Cold War, or about how insular the American public is, about fear of getting into future forever wars, or how we want to leave allies and indeed NATO itself at an arm's length? All of this is vital to what we're talking about now. And Soviet Russian scholars, American scholars of Russia, are startled by the parallels between the rhetoric of Putin and of earlier Soviet rhetoric after World War II. So all these issues are coming to the fore.
You see the same thing in China. They just celebrated the 100th anniversary of the founding of the Chinese Communist Party, and Xi Jinping is very consciously, I think, channeling some of anyone who studied Mao will see some familiar outlines.
Here's a footnote. These books, the book we're talking about tonight, Grand Improvisation, and also the book from 20 years ago, The 50-Year Wound, Crude Price of America's Cold War Victory, those have been translated by the Chinese at great expense by Shanghai People's Publishing, because not that they're my books, but that Chinese leadership is making a great effort to do a study of American Cold War history, and particularly the American replacement, as they call it, of the British Empire. How did this all happen? And of course, presumably, they are seeing insights for themselves.
Excellent tee up for our next question from Tom, who asks, did Great Britain's recognition of the communist government in China demonstrate that it was still a world player at that time, in contrast to the United States' aversion to China?
Oh, yes, it did. Oh, yes, it did. And it created an enormous controversy in the United States when Britain proceeded very quickly to recognize the new regime of Mao Zedong in January 1950. And we had gotten assurances over and over and over from Foreign Secretary Bevin that that would not happen. And then out of the blue, it did. And as the questioner emphasized, it very much was due to Britain asserting itself on the global stage. And indeed, remember that Britain dragged its feet for a long time on the founding of Israel. About a year, it would not recognize the founding of Israel for a variety of reasons. But when it came time to recognize China, and the US said, don't, Bevan archly said, well, do you want us to drag our feet the way we did on Israel, which of course the US didn't. So it's a way that you can see these leaders of these two global powers, the British Empire and the United States, still jousting with each other, and how they dealt with the People's Republic of China is a fascinating test case.
Excellent. We have time for a few more questions here. So our next question is from Ralph, and he's thanking Dr. Leibarth for this great lesson about America and the British Empire and the world. And then he says, the role of George Marshall is not given enough credit, in his opinion. Who is the 2021 plus George Marshall? Maybe not an American.
Oh, I think Marshall was a unique individual in his preternatural composure. He was like a statue pointing back to the old republic of early American days, of the civilian relationships with proper military power. It's hard to find another example. And to be sure, one cannot idealize Marshall, however, because there are disturbing racial issues in his leadership. But Marshall, by and large, is a master of civil military affairs, as a developer, above all, of talent, certainly including Eisenhower, in his ability to work with American presidents, Franklin Roosevelt, and to be sure, Harry Truman, is really unsurpassed. And it would be beyond me to offer anyone to compare nowadays.
Excellent. Speaking of, not idolizing anybody too much, Richard asks, could you expand a bit on your criticism of Kennan? As an old Princetonian, we were led to lionize his historical significance.
Well, that is unfortunate because there are few redeeming features in the character of George Kennan. Not just his personal values, but the dissembling in his memoirs, outright falsehoods, as about the length of the long telegram, which he grossly exaggerated and knowingly exaggerated, about his decrying the ability of the superb Secretary of the Treasury, John Snyder. These are outright falsehoods. And Kennan's biographers have not drilled deep enough, as I argue, to reveal these falsehoods. Time and again, not just during the Truman administration, but his interaction with Eisenhower, he utterly disdained Franklin Roosevelt as being intellectually inferior, as Kennan did toward most anyone, and to Eisenhower and to Dulles, and on and on. My summation is that Kennan requires a far, far more skeptical, deeper look, and perhaps not by his fellow intellectuals who just assume that his sparkling writing is testimony to the truth.
All right, we have time for one more question, and this one comes from Mike. And Mike says, my dad grew up during the Great Depression, and it formed a lot of lifetime habits. I found it interesting that you indicated the Great Depression lingered for a decade or more in our thinking. With that being an event Americans lived through, what are your thoughts about the pandemic and its impact on our future?
Well, first, let me thank Mike for that superb question. The last hearings on the Hill about the return of the Depression were in 1954 and 55. It affected time and time again decisions about America's role in the world. But there is a tricky thing about the Cold War. security, national security very quickly became more important to the United States than did the economy and the economic well-being of its citizens. Drawing parallels between the Great Depression and today is exactly the subject of my next book, which is a new understanding of Franklin Roosevelt and the four key lieutenants who worked most closely with him from the earliest days of the administration right through the end of the presidency. And the Depression, as your dad, our grandparents know, affected so much of the decades after World War II. The values, the policy making, the fears of returning to that searing time.
Excellent. That is the perfect question to end on, I think. Thank you all for joining us today, and congratulations once again to Derek Leibarth for winning the 2020 Harry S. Truman Book Award. To learn more about the post-war relationship between the United States and the United Kingdom, you can purchase Grand Improvisation, America Confronts the British Superpower, 1945 to 1957, anywhere books are sold, including Rainy Day Books right here in Kansas City. Tickets are now on sale to visit the all-new Truman Library. Reservations are required in advance. As always, members enjoy the benefit of free year-round access to the museum. To become a member or purchase your tickets, visit trumanlibraryinstitute.org. Derek and Jason, thank you again so much for joining us this evening. And thank you all for joining us to celebrate this Truman Book Award. Have a great evening.